Hello there. It is I, Dr. Jones. Dr. Mark. That's okay. You guys can still call me Mark. Uh, Once we're all back on campus, probably next fall, I'll give out autographs. Um, I'm freshly shorn like a sheep in the summer. I assume that's when you shear sheep. Uh, as you can see here. And I recorded this video last night, but my computer crashed. So here I am recording it again. So we're talking about evolution and human behavior. I'm going to be breaking this up into two videos probably. Let's dive in, shall we? All right. So we've talked about evolution in terms of primates. We've talked about evolution in terms of earlier hominin ancestors, and all that stuff is fairly straightforward and not so controversial, even when it comes to talking about evolution of certain types of behavior. Primates are evolved to be social creatures. We talked about kin selection and altruism. We talked about mating strategies and life history strategies, but it becomes a little bit more controversial or unsettling for some when we start talking about how evolution may have shaped modern human behavior. So let's just kind of clear that up. The reason that some people find it controversial is because it sort of fits into this nature versus nurture debate. So if evolution plays a large role in our behavioral tendencies, that seems to lean very heavily on the nature side of the argument, and it can seem at first that means, that we really have no choices, that we're essentially just robots doing what we're programmed to do, but it's actually way more complicated than that. Nature versus nurture is sort of a false dichotomy. Both nature and environment, they can't really be disentangled. So let's talk about why having some degree of flexibility in your behavior is actually adaptive, rather than being sort of canalized or programmed to do just one thing per one stimulus. So environments change, right? And natural selection being the primary driver of adaptation. Okay, it's not the only force of evolution, remember, but it is a driver of adaptation to the environment. Well, what is adaptive or what is more fit, remember, depends on the environment. If the environment changes, what is maximally adaptive for that environment also changes, right? So we've seen that example with the peppered moths, how initially the light-colored moths, the sort of speckled ones, were better camouflaged, but after the Industrial Revolution and soot started to turn everything darker colors, then the darker moths were better camouflaged. So the environment can shift. So it makes sense to have some flexibility in your behavior, so that your behavior can be as adaptive as possible under a range of different environmental circumstances, right? Even within one environment, there's different niches in that environment, different sort of micro ecosystems. There's different events that will occur within that environment, right? So what would be maximally adaptive in terms of natural selection and the evolution of behavioral tendencies would be certain behavioral predispositions with flexibility built in, right? So, some obvious things are we get hungry, right? And that tells us that we need to eat. And to some extent, what we want to eat might be partially conditioned on what our bodies need, but it's also conditioned by other things like culture, the availability of foods, the types of foods that we're used to. And we can be hungry, but we cannot eat, right? Like if we know we're going to get a little bit of exercise. Maybe it would be better to just have a snack and then have your large meal after that, right? So there's behavioral flexibility built into that. Our brains are, and the brains, I suppose, of all sentient beings are good at solving problems that are common in our environment, right? So things that we don't come across quite as often, you know, those are kinds of things that are not shaped to quite the same degree by natural selection, right? But those types of issues that occur frequently in our environment are the things that we are kind of adapted to deal with. So if you take rats, like if you look at this picture over here of this rat digging around in some garbage. Now, normally rats live in dark environments, and so they can't really see very well all the time what they're eating, right? And they're scavengers, so they're kind of omnivores. They will eat a variety of different things, and some things they may not have encountered before. So how do they know they're not going to be eating something poisonous? Well, they have sort of a behavior that is adapted to that type of environment where they will taste food, and if it's a novel food that they haven't really tasted before, they'll try just a little bit of it, and then they'll leave it. They'll go on about their day. Maybe they'll eat some other things, and if they get sick, then they will associate it with that new taste. And if they ever taste it again, they won't eat it. But if they can eat it and they don't get sick, they know it's fine. So because they live in a dark environment, they don't really judge this based on, say, the color of the food, the appearance of the food, the shape of the food. They base it mainly on taste, right? And so that's a behavior that has adapted based on the kind of environment that they're in. Now, when we talk about modern human evolution, the types of environments and the types of problems that we are behaviorally adapted for, the hypothesis is that those come from the so-called environment of evolutionary adaptation. So before I describe what that is, you have to understand that unlike a simple Mendelian trait where it's controlled by one locus on the genome, and you might have 2 or 3 different alleles, 2 or 3 different polymorphisms there, behavior is something that's influenced by hundreds, if not thousands, of genes. And the brain is an extremely complex organ. Our behavior is conditioned by our brain, by how we process problems, by the environment. So the process of evolution and the process of adaptation of behavior takes a very, very long time, because there's a lot of things that can be tweaked, right? So any kind of maximal adaptation of our behavior must have occurred over long periods of time. And if we are adapted for particular things, it's problems that we faced over those long periods of time. Okay, so for example, we are actually not that great at certain types of complex reasoning involving numbers. Obviously, we have math whizzes and geniuses, and you can learn math over time, but this is not kind of a skill that we are born with. And cultures where they don't typically, say, like write down numbers or deal with the manipulation of large numbers, people tend to not be so great at that without a long period of learning. And that's because in this environment of evolutionary adaptation, we really didn't need that skill, right? It had nothing, modern finance and systems of money and payment and debt, that is very recent in our evolutionary history, right? So most of human history has been in in the circumstances of a hunting and gathering lifestyle, or foraging. So probably that was the environment of a lot of our hominin ancestors, at least maybe starting with Homo, genus Homo. And that continued up until at the earliest, like 12,000 years ago. So the earliest agriculture seems to have occurred in the Near East around 12,000 years ago, and it didn't occur everywhere in the world at that time. So it's very, very new in the span of human evolution, right? So the hypothesis here is that we must be adapted to this foraging environment in small-scale societies with a small number of individuals, right? And so that's the environment of evolutionary adaptation. In this environment, we know, like from ethnographic and historical research, that one of the things that the behaviors that's encountered in this type of environment is reciprocal altruism. So we talked about the evolution of altruistic behavior based on kin selection. But what if you are not necessarily living in a group where you're related to the majority of individuals? You know, maybe you're related to some of them. But what explains altruistic behavior also between strangers? It's this idea of reciprocal altruism. So because we have a complex and highly developed cultural sort of instinct as people, there are social mechanisms to enforce that type of altruism, right? So a lot of hunter-gatherer societies, they share meat. So it doesn't matter who the hunter was, everybody will get a share of that meat. And you assume, if it's you that's the hunter and you're doling out the meat, that, you know, later on when someone else is the successful hunter, even if you weren't present, you and your family will get a share of their meat, right? And if you don't, then that person has cheated you, right? It's gone against your cultural sense of fairness. And so even though cultures will define fairness differently, which we'll talk about in a different lecture, people are always on the lookout for those who do not hold up their cultural version of fairness, right? So we are very adept at spotting cheating behavior, right? Something that goes against social norms of what we consider to be fair. And that's so that we can sanction individuals who kind of go against this system of reciprocal altruism. So now I want to show you a video of these capuchin monkeys who have a sense of fairness as well. And normally I would just let you watch the video on your own, but because this is really good, important video, I want to make sure that you watch it. So I'm going to try to switch over to YouTube here. Here we go. Okay, I hope you're still there. I'm going to just step aside while you listen to Frans de Waal, famous primatologist, talk about this experiment.
It's our fairness study. And so this became a very famous study, and there's now many more, because after we did this about 10 years ago, it became very well known. And we did that originally with capuchin monkeys, and I'm going to show you the first experiment that we did. It has now been done with dogs, and with birds, and with chimpanzees. But with Sarah Brosnan, we started out with capuchin monkeys. So what we did is we put two capuchin monkeys side by side. Again, these animals, they live in a group. They know each other. We take them out of the group, put them in a test chamber. And there's a very simple task that they need to do. And if you give both of them cucumber for the task, the two monkeys side by side, they're perfectly willing to do this 25 times in a row. So cucumber, even though it's really only water in my opinion, but cucumber is perfectly fine for them. Now, if you give the partner grapes, the food preferences of my capuchin monkeys correspond exactly with the prices in the supermarket. And so if you give them grapes, that's a far better food, then you create inequity between them. So that's the experiment we did. Recently, we videotaped it with new monkeys who had never done the task, thinking that maybe they would have a stronger reaction, and that turned out to be right. The one on the left is the monkey who gets cucumber. The one on the right is the one who gets grapes. The one who gets cucumber, note that the first piece of cucumber is perfectly fine. The first piece she eats. Then she sees the other one getting grape, and you will see what happens. So she gives a rock to us, that's the task. And we give her a piece of cucumber, and she eats it. The other one needs to give a rock to us. And that's what she does. And she gets a grape. And she eats it. The other one sees that. She gives a rock to us now, gets again cucumber. She tests the rock now against the wall. She needs to give it to us. And she gets cucumber again. So this is basically the Wall Street protest that you see here.
Moving on. So one of the things that is also kind of an evolved behavior is inbreeding avoidance. Okay, we all have this sense that inbreeding, not a great idea, and we, part of that is certainly cultural, something that you kind of are maybe not explicitly taught, but you learn pretty early on that that's not something that you're all that interested in, right? And you may know the reason for it, but basically it's because the more closely related you are to an individual, the more likely you are to have the same allele at the same locus, right? The more similar you are to them genetically. There are a certain number of genetic diseases that are based on recessive alleles, and not all genetic diseases are recessive. Some of them are dominant, but those ones that are recessive can often be masked, because if you're heterozygous, if you have one recessive and one dominant, then you're not going to express that phenotype, so you won't have that disease. You'll just be sort of a carrier of that trait. Now, if you were to mate with someone very closely related with you and you were a carrier of one of those recessive traits, it's quite likely that they have the same trait at that locus, right? So there's a much greater chance that your children will be homozygous recessive for that trait, and so have a potentially deadly or impactful genetic disease. Right, so inbreeding typically reduces the fitness on average of the children of those pairings, right? So it makes sense to try to avoid that, because let's say you don't keep track of who your kin are. I know that's hard to imagine, but let's just imagine for a second that you don't know who you're mating with. And and you have a child with someone, and if you're a female, that means carrying this child to term, that means gestating a baby, that means investing all kinds of resources and opportunity cost when you could be mating with someone that would that sort of pairing would result in a more fit offspring. And then you give birth to that offspring, and then you have to invest resources in the growth and maturation of that individual. And then if they have a disease, then they probably won't survive to reproductive age, and won't pass on your genes. So that's very strongly selected against, right? So if there were a behavior or a set of behaviors that helped you to avoid those types of things, well, that would be quite adaptive, and that behavior would spread, because on average, people with that behavior would run into this problem less frequently. So this is something that's even been tested in other primates, like these callitrichid monkeys. they did an experiment where females were housed with their mother and their father, and those females did not reproduce. However, when that father was replaced with an unrelated male, both the mother and the daughter reproduced with that male. So they have some way of keeping track of who their kin are, or because they're raised in this environment with this individual, they have no interest in mating with them. We also see among chimpanzees that there's age preferences for males and for females that make related individuals more incompatible with one another. So, for example, female chimps prefer their male mates to be not very much older than them, meaning that a daughter would be less likely to mate with her father. Male chimps who tend to leave the groups that they were born into once they reach sexual maturity, and they go and they join other groups. Male chimps tend to prefer females that are not very much younger than them. So that means that in their new environment, they're not going to be, now that they're sexually mature, they're not going to be interested in mating with their daughters because their daughters would be significantly younger than them, right? So whether or not they can keep track of who their kin are in their group, this sort of age preference behavior helps them to avoid inbreeding. We know also from historical and ethnographic evidence that humans avoid close inbreeding as well. It seems to be a human universal. So now cultures, as we'll see in the next slide, they define inbreeding differently, but of all the cultures that have been studied ethnographically and historically, there aren't any that regularly practice marriage or mating between siblings or between parents and children. The one kind of exception to that is Roman Egypt in the first 2 centuries AD. They found records of marriages and wedding invitations between siblings. It wasn't super frequent, but it wasn't uncommon. And that probably has to do with cultural practices around, keeping the nobility within itself, sort of passing on the noble bloodline and not diluting it. So it was a matter of convenience, but this practice obviously didn't last for very long. So as I said, there are some cultural particulars here when it comes to inbreeding. It's not defined the same way in all cultures. There are some cultures, and if you took my 101 class, you know about this. There are some cultures where first cousins are encouraged to marry in certain circumstances. Despite our perspective and our society of that being kind of icky, it's actually not as harmful or not as dangerous in terms of genetic diseases as a brother-sister or a parent-child mating. And, that just has to do with the probability that you're going to have the same trait at the same locus. Now, looking at this is a pedigree. This is like a family pedigree of individuals. Males are triangles and females are circles. This triangle here that is called ego, that's the individual that we're referencing here. So that's our point of reference. So if you look at ego, this circle next to ego is his sister, and this triangle next to him is his brother. And then these individuals are cousins on his mother's side. These individuals are cousins on his father's side. Now, in some cultures, if they trace descent through the father and the father's father and so on, like your name is passed on, for example, they might say, we don't want ego to marry a woman in his patrilineage, so with the same last name, let's say, as the father. So it wouldn't be a good idea for ego to marry this female because her father is ego's uncle, right? And they're part of the same patrilineage, and so is she. But they might encourage ego to marry his father's sister's daughter. Okay, those are called cross cousins because this daughter, the yellow circle here, belongs to her father's patrilineage, and you don't see her father on here, but it's whoever is married to her mother. So there are certain cultural practices where that's encouraged. But again, you don't see sibling mating or parent-child mating regularly in any cultures, right? It's not something that's sanctioned. Does it happen on occasion? Yes, because people are, capable of doing a lot of different things, but it's not something that is culturally sanctioned or approved of in any culture that we're aware of. I'm going to pause here and start again with a part two. So I will be back shortly, and stay tuned.